Hello, everyone. I hope you had or are having a great week 11. I know that we're pretty excited to give you all this information on ageism and adultism as we've learned throughout the past weeks, and we'll just kind of jump into it. So, starting, I guess, with ageism and adultism, it's important to start kind of toward the beginning before we talk about the present day and the future. So, we're going to go through some key historical moments. I broke it down into kind of three that really just kind of are pinpoints through the ageism timeline. And starting with, I guess, what I'm calling the birth of ageism, it was around long before we were able to label it. Like a lot of the different isms that we've been talking about, just because we were able to finally put a term with what was happening doesn't mean that it wasn't happening before. Actually, uh, Dr. Robert Butler, who's mentioned here, was the one that coined the term, but he coined it in 1969. However, if you look back at history, all the way back in 4 BC with some Neolithic cultures, older age and ageism was viewed as a disease. And often in these cultures, when the tribe or the community was moving from place to place, the older, more lack of mobile individuals were kind of abandoned and left behind. However, to talk about Dr. Butler, because he is such an influential person inside of the ageism timeline, he was originally a psychiatrist by trade, but he was so passionate about the lack of care given to older individuals in society and the discrimination against them that he kind of quit his daytime job and became at one point a Democratic nominee for president uh, solely on the platform to fight back against ageism. However, what is ageism? And that is um, any discrimination toward individuals who are older. Typically, it's looked at as older than 40, the age of 40. So when you're talking about where it lies inside of history is a lot of time in early society, work was done in the home, such as farming and different things like that. So older individuals were able to maintain a way of life by working from home. But when kind of the industrial age came around in America, you saw a lot of jobs and a lot of companies and factories not hire individuals because they didn't work as well, as efficient, as fast. So Dr. Butler kind of saw this coming about, and then being a psychiatrist, he also pointed out that a lot of the negative feelings we had toward older people was actually a fear of vulnerability from ourselves, kind of a fear of getting older, that when we get older, we're going to be helpless and vulnerable. And we were just kind of translating the feelings of our own fear on those individuals that we were seeing before us. And then moving into the Great Depression, which, yes, does happen before 1969, but it's kind of what I'm calling the battleground, like the first, I guess, big decision and big kind of fight for any sort of anti-ageist um, piece. And that's, the Great Depression, you saw around 20,000 Americans reach unemployment. It was greater in individuals over the age of 40. Um, and the big thing that really comes out of the Great Depression is Social Security. And that's important because it was a senator from Arizona, a radio talk show host from Michigan, and then a South Dakota physician by the name of Francis E. Townsend advocated and pushed for Social Security, which allowed for these retired, older individuals that weren't able to even work, let alone get a job in the climate of the Great Depression. It allowed them to still receive some funding so they could function as humans and live. So that was eventually passed in 1940. But up until then, Townsend started a movement. And within this movement, he actually got the United States government to pay individuals over 60, $200 a month, with the only kind of, I guess, caveat is what I'm going to call it, being that they have to spend that $200 within that month. And while $200, I guess, for me and probably for most people in today's society doesn't sound like a ton of money in one for to live off for 1 month. $200 in 1935 was a decent chunk of change that an individual could live off of. And then last, you have the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or ADEA. And with that, it's really vital because this is the first, step the United States took in any form of legislation as a country to fight back against ageism and ageist kind of mindsets. And the two big things that come out of this is it um, broke down and fought back and eliminated uh, people, companies, and individuals from having to mandatory retire, meaning that a company used to say, all right, you're done, you can't work anymore. But this document kind of says that you can't do that. If an individual wants to continue working after, the age of 40 or however long, they're allowed to do so. And then kind of the second piece is, what if an individual wants to get a job and they're over the age of 40? A company can't discriminate against them, is pretty much what this legislation is saying. And that's huge because I know people, for me, like in my family's past, like my grandparents, my grandma worked well past the age of 40. So did my grandpa. So it's big that they weren't discriminated against as far as their age when looking for employment. So now a little bit more on kind of what is ageism. As previously mentioned, Dr. Butler was kind of the first one to bring up this terminology of ageism, and then he went kind of beyond just defining what ageism is, as in that it's four different types. So we have personal, institutional, and intentional, as well as unintentional ageism. And we're going to go through all of them and kind of explain the differences between all of them, as you could probably guess from the names what they are, but we'll just kind of go through it. So, first, we have personal ageism, which is ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and practices on the part of individuals that are biased against a person or group based on their older age. I think for this, it's like just you as an individual, kind of your own personal bias toward people that are older than you. But also, if for people that are older than like the age of 40 that fall inside this ageism category, it's their personal feelings toward themselves, is another way to kind of look at it. And really, personal ageism starts from kind of our learnings when we're younger, and looking at how are we taught to interact with people that are older than us. I like to bring up Albert Bandura, who did the Bobble experiment and kind of learned behavior. It's very similar, I think, in this facet of personal ageism when you think about how did your parents teach you to interact with kind of your grandparents, or how did, you know, your family interact when it came to people that were, I guess, just in kind of that older age group. And then looking at institutional ageism, so missions, rules, and practices that discriminate against individuals or groups because of their older age. For this, you're looking at kind of a system. So similar to what like institutional racism, institutional ageism is very similar. You're looking at kind of, you can't go to school here because you're 45 years old and we as an institution don't believe that you should seek a degree. Like that's institutional ageism, and different things like that, or just making it harder for individuals to get into school or to get through school because of their age, is kind of where institutional ageism is taking its points off of. And then we have intentional ageism. This one for me is like these are just bad people. So it's ideas, attitudes, rules, and practices that are carried out with the knowledge that they are biased against a person or group based on their older age. Intentional ageism includes carrying out practices that take advantage of the vulnerabilities of older persons. So I think the best way to kind of get intentional ageism across is like scam artists. That's kind of what I went for in the photo here, but it's like people that are intentionally taking advantage of those that are older than because maybe they don't know something. And I think about that a lot now with technology and how we live in this age of technology that a lot of the older generation maybe didn't grow up with. And you can see a lot of kind of scam artists and different individuals that are taking advantage of folks that are older than us, which is just plain wrong. This is the one that for me is just tough to kind of take as an individual. And then last, unintentional ageism. I think this one, first, it's ideas, attitudes, rules, or practices that are carried out with that are carried without the perpetrator's awareness that they are biased against a person's or group based on their older age. Um, and this is pretty much that implicit bias. So we all have implicit biases within inside of us. And so I think when you're talking about unintentional ageism, you're talking about kind of what are your own personal implicit bias toward individuals that are maybe older than you? What are your feelings toward individuals that are older than you? And I think while this one is the most common that would happen just based off of it being an implicit bias, it's also, I think, the one that we can more readily correct and fight against than some of the other ones. So, and now, kind of moving beyond the four different types of ageism, we kind of move into ageist terminology. And this is super important when talking about ageism because language carries and conveys meanings, which feeds assumptions and judgments that can lead and develop to stereotypes and discrimination, especially toward individuals that are older than us. And we all know that words carry impact, and the words that we use, while sometimes are unintentional to cause harm, the impact they cause is very detrimental. So I kind of threw up two different categories here. We had in the daily life, so you see like ancient, crotchety old man, kind of different things like that. But then in the medical profession, and I think that this one is the one that I really wanted to highlight because um, you have like nursing homes and older individuals, just by the nature of bodies breaking down, are more frequently inside of medical care. And this is really where you see a lot of today's ageism, um, and kind of, at least as far as direct and maybe it's unintentional in the fact that medical care workers don't mean to necessarily offend or discriminate against older individuals, but by just the nature of maybe their terminology and different things that they do are actually discriminating against and partaking inside of the ageist culture that their profession has created um, in and of itself.
Within higher education, ageism affects both older college faculty and older students. Starting with faculty, ageism plays a role in many issues they face in the workplace, as well as how long they are able to work in their offices. After lots of dissatisfaction with the mandatory retirement policy in the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, or the ADEA, the ADEA amendments of 1978 were released. These amendments abolished mandatory retirement for federal employees and raised the minimum age for retirement to 70 for employees working in the private sector. Unfortunately, for the first 3 years after the passing of this law, tenured college faculty were still exempt from protection. There were many myths supporting mandatory retirement, such as the mental deterioration of humans over time. The National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Aging debunked these myths, but the higher education sector chose to ignore those findings. Many institutions were in favor of mandatory retirement for economic reasons. Young instructors were less expensive to hire and retain than older professors. Others believe that older faculty should be pushed out to make room for younger faculty to progress in their careers. There were some college professors that did not agree with the ageist practices of their institutions. Despite this, they did not openly oppose those practices because it helped to further their own career interests. Rather than make chronological age the deciding factor for job retention, Bernard Forman suggested other ways to test the competency of faculty. For example, in his article, he highlighted the use of temporary contract extensions that included reviews by appropriate authorities. Also, he suggested performance tests such as the United States Army Physical Profile Series, which was a very effective test. Besides mandatory retirement concerns, older faculty also deal with a lack of respect within their departments. After getting to a certain age, their ideas are ignored and they find themselves pushed out of conversations entirely, despite the great amount of knowledge that they may have on the topic. For older women in faculty, the intersection of gender and ageism is prevalent. They are moved out of leadership positions or are pushed to take quote unquote, gender appropriate roles. These roles often center around student welfare. Demi Semi and Jonathan Matusitz studied the effects of ageism on older college students. Their study used social closure theory as the focal point to understand how ageism shows up in different realms of the undergraduate experience. The role of age in higher education and the qualities of adult learners work together to help us better apply social closure theory. Starting with the role of age, higher education institutions have two different groups of students, the traditional student and the non-traditional student, also known as the adult learner. Traditional students are students between the ages of 18 and 24 who enter college right after high school. These students are more likely to be taking classes full time and may be financially dependent on a parent or guardian. Adult learners are usually over the age of 25 and have postponed college for 1 or more years after high school graduation. They also are more likely to be part time students with full time jobs and are more likely to be financially independent. Because adult learners are the fastest growing population of newly enrolled undergraduates, it's important that higher education institutions take more strides to consider them in policy changes and in programming. Adult learners have many unique qualities that separate them from younger students. Many of them become motivated to pursue higher education due to different life changes. As a result, they may take their education more seriously than the average college student. For example, adult learners participate more often in class and come to class more prepared than younger students. They also enjoy incorporating real work experiences into their academics. Although adult learners make up a significant part of higher education institutions' population, they still face neglect in terms of their learning interests and styles. The elimination of adult necessities when developing policies and curricula leaves adult learners feeling disregarded compared to their younger peers. Furthermore, they find themselves on the receiving end of prejudice and rejection from many services within the institution due to their age. Semi and Matusitz define social closure theory as dominant group members keeping resources and opportunities only for people who share similar traits. By doing this, other groups are prevented from benefiting from those resources. The dominant group regulates exposure to resources and opportunities through omission. If you don't know it exists, you can't benefit from it. This behavior of omission is not always on purpose. Sometimes it may happen subconsciously or through traditional practices. We can see social closure theory's effect on adult learners through the realms of college entry, financial aid, academic performance, classroom environment, and campus involvement. During college entry, the admissions process is mostly geared towards traditional students. Many schools emphasize how they can help students grow and evolve into well rounded adults. This leaves adult learners out of the conversation because they likely do not need that same guidance. In terms of financial aid, adult learners receive less aid in the form of scholarships and grants. Also, because they already have adult responsibilities, they sometimes carry debts that can disqualify them from other types of aid. Further, many financial aid amounts are predicated on the amount of credit hours a student enrolls in. The more hours you take, the more aid you are likely to get. The current financial aid model is made for traditional students who are mostly full-time, and thus it keeps adult learners who are mostly part-time students from obtaining the highest amount of aid that they can get. As for academic performance, many universities expect students to be self-reliant. This means that there's very little faculty assistance with coursework, especially at large universities. Many adult learners find themselves repeating courses and using secondary sources in order to learn the material and pass their classes. In the classroom, a lot of the curricula caters to the full-time younger students. For adult learners, who in many cases have life commitments outside of college and campus life, it can feel isolating. Also, adult learners can sometimes find themselves riding the line between being respected for their experience and being ridiculed for it. They also deal with competition against their younger peers. Semi and Matusits also highlight that many female minority adult learners feel discouraged and unsupported in the classroom, which leads to them not participating for fear of being rejected for saying something wrong. Finally, obligations outside the classroom can leave adult learners with little free time for campus involvement. This results in a lack of relationships with their peers and faculty, and possibly a lack of connection with the institution as a whole. Adult learners are less likely to stay on campus after finishing up with classes for the day. We can see this in that adult learners make up 47% of student volunteers, 12% of research assistants, and 27% of extracurricular participants. And this is in comparison to 69, 23, and 69% of traditional students, respectively. Within higher education, there have been lawsuits where institutions have violated age discrimination laws. In both the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, versus Wilbur Wright College and EEOC versus San Francisco State University, lecturers were denied professor positions in favor of younger, less qualified candidates. At Wilbur Wright College, Rosemary Crane was the only part-time instructor to receive a Teaching Excellence Award. And yet, her age overpowered her achievements, and she was not promoted. What makes it worse is that a former department head told her that her age was the factor that disqualified her from the position. At San Francisco State University, Dr. Lawford Goddard served as a lecturer for over 15 years and also had over 30 years of experience at other Bay Area institutions. Even still, he was passed over for an assistant professor position for another candidate that did not even have their PhD, which was a requirement for the position. EEOC versus The Ohio State University was a lawsuit filed after a 53-year-old human resources generalist and two other employees in their 60s were fired from the College of Education and Human Ecology. They were replaced by younger, less qualified employees. Although they all received satisfactory performance reviews, they were fired and unable to be reemployed in other human resources positions at the university. All three lawsuits from the EEOC were filed after first attempting to be settled outside of court. Finally, two former professors of architecture at the University of Oregon sued the university and a former dean for ageist practices. In 2017, the university attempted to permanently reassign those professors from the Portland campus to the Eugene campus based solely on their age. Also, some graduate courses that the professors taught were given to younger part-time adjunct faculty. Both professors' contracts with the university stipulated that they would be based in Portland. After 2.5 years of litigation, the professors settled with the university. However, the university does have a policy that allows them to move professors from one location to another. Because this policy was created before there was more than one campus, that part of the case is still ongoing to determine whether the university was within their right to reassign the professors to a different campus. Adultism is an ideology that assumes young people are inferior to adults solely due to their age. Many developmental theories support this idea in that they suggest that humans mature solely through age based guidelines. As a result, adults are encouraged to dismiss the ideas and input of the youth. Adultism manifests in both youth adult interactions and in social structures. In interactions, you can see adultism in the abuse or policing of youth. John Bell says it best in that adults reserve the right to punish, threaten, hit, take away, take away privileges, and ostracize young people when such actions are deemed to be instrumental in controlling or disciplining them. This is especially true in K through 12 schools, especially in urban schools that are primarily populated by minoritized students. For example, schools limit the amount of social interaction that students have throughout the day, such as only allowing them to sit at specific tables during lunch or giving silent lunch as a punishment. Another example from my own middle school is that we were expected to walk only on a green line that was on the far right of the hallway, and we got in trouble if we drifted off that line. In social structures, the youth have very little opportunities to exercise social power. Many of the privileges afforded to society are inaccessible to the youth. Essentially, besides incarcerated people and other people in institutionalized groups, the youth is considered one of the most controlled groups in society. Similar to older people, the youth deal with disrespect as well as disregard for their ideas and feelings. Also, although the youth are perfectly capable of making decisions for themselves, they are kept out of the majority of decisions that affect them. Bertrand et al. Discuss the importance of sanctioned collaboration between the youth and adults in terms of educational decision making. Their study highlights the great influence that the youth can have on school and district wide educational policies. Adultist behavior is culturally based. Something that may be considered adultist in one culture may be acceptable in another. Also, not every interaction between the youth and adults is a form of adultism. Because children and young people are moving through so many developmental stages, it is important for adults to offer guidance, support, love, and discipline where appropriate. Behaviors come adultist when they become, quote, a consistent pattern of disrespect and mistreatment, end quote. As you've grown up, have you ever heard any of the following common adultist statements from adults in your life? As long as you're in my house, you will do as I say. What do you know? You haven't had any real life experience. Don't talk to me like that. I'm your insert adult figure. It's just a phase. You'll get over it. These statements serve as a way to ignore the real feelings and choices of young people simply because adults believe that they know more. Some common ways that adultism occurs are through physical and sexual abuse, non physical punishments or threats, denied control of a young person's body, space, or possessions, and verbal interactions. Non physical punishments or threats happen when children and young people are constantly berated, invalidated, insulted, and given arbitrary punishments. If they protest, they receive more punishment. Denying children and young adults control of their bodies, space, and possessions can be something as simple as forcing a child to hug a relative or a friend that they don't want to. Behaviors like this can be very detrimental because, in the worst case scenario, it can lead to children and young people being subjected to physical and sexual abuse. In verbal interactions, the youth is expected to listen to adults and only speak when spoken to. Some adults do not view young people as having anything of value to say and even speak about them as if they're not even there. All of these statements and occurrences, and so many others, can have lasting effects on the youth. As they grow up, adultist behaviors and ideals can result in young people that go into adulthood accepting mistreatment from others. Conversely, they can begin acting in oppressive ways towards others who they feel are in less powerful positions than them. This further reinforces the cycle of disrespect and renders adultism as something that is natural and normal. Some ways that young people can be negatively affected by adultism are an undermined self confidence and self esteem, an increasing sense of worthlessness, an increasing feeling of powerlessness, a diminishing ability to function well in the world, increasing destructive acting out or self destructive acting, and feelings of being unloved or unwanted. Although all of these factors may not be entirely caused by adultism, they can be heightened by other isms and hardships that young people face. In education, adultism can have negative academic effects. For example, much of the curricula that students are taught is based on what adults feel are the most valuable skills to know. Much of what students accomplish in school is for the approval of adults, which can cause distrust and competition between peers. As student affairs professionals, it is important that we combat ageist and adultist ideas and behaviors within our offices and within our roles. We want to challenge discrimination and foster effective youth adult and adult elder relationships to continue working towards socially just and equitable environments.
So, now that you guys know a little bit more about the definitions of ageism and adultism and how they can be present in institutions of higher education, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the statistics of non-traditional students in higher education and how student affairs professionals and universities and institutions can work to combat ageism and adultism in the work that they do. So first, we're going to look a little bit at the statistics of adult learners, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about how this is going to impact student affairs professionals moving forward. So first, I have some statistics up here on the screen. So one of the main trends is that more and more adults are enrolling in four-year institutions. The number of adults enrolled in a full or part-time school has risen by 194% from 1970 to 2010. And the projected trend is that the growth pattern will continue through 2024, with adult male students increasing by 13% and adult female students increasing by 16%. I would also like to note that this does uphold a gender binary here by categorizing the students in this way, and there was not an option for non-binary students. But these are the statistics that we have to work with, and so it's just something to note and take with us as we conduct research down the road so that we can be more inclusive in the numbers that we're providing. But anyway, side note aside, the National Center for Educational Statistics predicts that by 2025, adult learners will form 42% of the country's student body. So that is a huge amount of non-traditional students. And so obviously that is going to impact higher education in the future. Also, another statistic that is important to note is that most adult students are enrolled as undergraduates. In fall 2016, 71% of adult students were enrolled in an undergraduate degree program, and 38% of all undergraduate students in the United States are older than 25. So I feel like the statistic is important to note because a lot of times when you hear undergrad, you think of 18-year-olds to 22-year-olds. And generally, that's just not the case anymore. A lot of adults are enrolling in undergraduate degree programs, maybe because they don't have an undergraduate degree or they potentially are not happy in the field that they're in and they're looking to get education in another field. So I think it's important that we just kind of deconstruct that held view that undergraduates are young students, because the trends are telling us that that's not always the case. And then the last important trend that I'd like to note is that only around half of adult students are full-time students. In the fall of 2016, 58% of adult students were enrolled as full-time students. So while that is a majority of adult students, it's still a very significant amount of adult students that are not full-time students. And that is obviously going to play into how these student populations are served in higher education institutions. So next, we're going to look at some implications for student affairs professionals. So these are just some wide implications. There are a lot more than I've listed here, but these are some of the ones that I think are the most relevant to us as practitioners, especially now in grad school and then potentially in the future. So one thing that is important to note is how this is going to impact programming. Because diversity of age is becoming the new normal in most schools, programmers should take the potential age gaps into account when providing programs for students. Obviously, what may be relevant for an 18-year-old may not be beneficial for a 40-year-old. So programs should reflect an understanding of the needs of a wide variety of students. This isn't to say that all programs have to be catered towards everyone, because it's not possible to cover every single base, but there should be program offerings for older adults, maybe a program about how these students can get in touch with their advisors easier, or how office hours work, or just certain things that aren't just catered to, young students who are just learning how to be adults. Because like we said in the last slide, not all undergraduates are young adults. Some are older, and the university should be providing programming for these students so that they can also benefit from the school that they're paying money to go to. Another implication is advising. Even though many adult learners are enrolled full-time, 42% of adult students are enrolled part-time. This type of schedule may require more advising to ensure that all degree requirements are met. Advisors should be prepared to engage more with adult students who are not embarking on the traditional career or education track. So this is just really important to ensure that our adult students are getting the attention and the help that they need. Often non-traditional education tracks can be confusing to complete because you're not doing the solid 15 credit hours every semester and finishing up in a 4-year time span. Sometimes you have to work around work schedules and familial schedules and just life schedules. And so advising for adult learners is really, really important, because these are the students that need the most help working around a lot of obstacles. Yes, advising for undergraduate students is obviously still important as they navigate institutions of higher education, but in particularly for adult learners, because it is not as common or thought of, it's important to train our advisors to help these students. And then lastly, I have facilitation. So the presence of adultism and ageism in universities cannot be denied. It's going to happen wherever there are diverse age ranges, where people can get looked down on because they're young, and people can get looked down on because they're older and maybe out of touch, as some would like to believe. And so it's important to engage and facilitate meaningful intergenerational contact that protect both the young and old from ageism and adultism. So we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but facilitating these organic interactions between different generations is so important to halt adultism and ageism, because there's just such a lack of understanding between generations. Even from millennials to Gen Z, a lot of you, I'm sure, know about all of the beef about middle parts and side parts and skinny jeans and flared jeans and all of these things. And there's just a lot of lack of understanding and a lot of stereotyping that goes on for every single generation. And so it's important as student affairs practitioners that we are trying to facilitate meaningful interactions between these different student populations to ensure that we are protecting our students from potential prejudices and discrimination. So moving on, combating ageism and adultism in higher education, what can student affairs professionals do? So I'm sure you guys are wondering now, what can we do in our own capacity to help our students that might be non-traditional, that might be younger? It all depends. So I'll give you some answers. So here are some interventions against ageism. Just to reiterate, ageism is prejudice against older adults because of their age and because of there's lots of stereotypes surrounding their mental capacity and things such as that. So these are some interventions against specifically ageism, and later we're going to talk about interventions against adultism. So right now, the first intervention against ageism is education. Surprise! As higher educational professionals, education is one of the greatest tools that we have to combat different sorts of prejudices on our campuses. So analysis of interventions to combat ageism indicate that education is an effective tool at reducing prejudice and discrimination against the elderly. Teaching students about the aging process, generational similarities and differences, and the presence and effects of ageism has been proven to improve youth's overall thoughts toward older adults. So, education is really, really important because there are a lot of misconceptions about older adults that go around, and a lot of people aren't aware of ageism. It's not one of the isms that you hear a lot about. And so it's really important that we are educating our younger students on the aging process and what it's like to be an older adult and how those things can affect your ways of thinking and your priorities. there's just not a lot of information out there for students to talk about aging. And it's really important to just make it normal so they understand, what older generations might be going through as they age and try to navigate an institution of higher education. So education is one of the first interventions that we can use. The next intervention is something that I talked about a little bit earlier, intergenerational contact. So according to multiple studies, positive contact experiences that connect younger adults to older adults can help reduce ageism. Specifically, experiences that are cooperative in nature and promote equal status of both persons help to dispel negative stereotypes and cultivate mutual respect. So these are really important because it's not just educating about how an older generation experiences things, but then it's also facilitating these experiences with older generations that help to dispel some of the negative stereotypes that students might hold about older adults. It is important to note, however, that sometimes intergenerational contact can have a bit of a negative effect because it upholds stereotypes. For example, if you are just introducing your students to residents in a nursing home, per se. Not that there is anything wrong with doing that, but a lot of the residents in nursing homes no longer have the autonomy to do a lot of things for themselves, like feed themselves or take their own medications or walk or get around. And while these things are all very real for a lot of older adults, it can kind of reinforce those negative stereotypes against older adults. So it's definitely important to, when you're facilitating this intergenerational contact, to have a wide variety of older adults and that have a wide variety of experiences, because a 95-year-old living at home on their own is going to have a lot of different stories to tell than a 95-year-old that's living in a nursing home. And both of those stories are very valid, but it's important that students are seeing both sides instead of just one, because not all older adults are capable of living on their own like that. And not all older adults are living in nursing homes. So a variety of experiences with a variety of older adult populations is very important for intergenerational contact to combat ageism as opposed to kind of reinforcing it. And then the last intervention that we have is reverse mentoring. So reverse mentoring programs combine education with intergenerational contact. By having younger adults mentor older adults, both parties are engaging in learning while having positive, fruitful interactions. A study on the University of Rhode Island's Engaging Generations Cyber Seniors program, a reverse mentoring program where students assisted adults with technology, indicated that students who participated had improved views on older adults and expressed greater interest in working with them in the future. So reverse mentoring can be an incredible tool to combat ageism because it allows the youth to engage with the older generation and teach them a life skill that is useful for the older generation. And then the older generation gets to interact with the youth and they get to dispel all of their adultist notions. So it's kind of great to work against both ageism and adultism because it combines education, it combines the contact, and it helps to just break down those walls that can exist between generations and really just humanize both sides of the coin and show that age is a number, and regardless, everyone is still human and we can always learn from each other. So reverse mentoring programs are a great way to intervene against ageism and adultism, honestly. And so now, though, we're going to get into some interventions against adultism. Spoiler alert, there it is. So one of the interventions we have here is meaningful student involvement. So in classrooms throughout the US, there exists a student involvement gap where some students are involved and others are not. This gap is often a result of adultism in schools where instructors exhibit bias toward adult learning and thus ostracize students who learn in other ways. To combat the negative consequences that this form of adultism can have, student affairs professionals should engage students as partners throughout the learning process in order to ensure their learning needs are met. So basically, this is all about just treating students as humans. So a lot of the times instructors will default to a certain form of teaching because that is how they learn and that is how they like to teach. And that kind of takes away a lot from students because if they don't learn in that way, then they'll fall behind. And so instead of, practicing this sort of adultist view on education, educators really need to Engage students as partners and ask them how they like to learn and what they think might be helpful to them, as opposed to just prescribing what you think is helpful, because every student is different. And the beauty of asking students to partner with you is that you can learn more about them and get new ideas to engage other students. So addressing the student involvement gap is a really important for higher education professionals, because a lot of students who have made it to secondary education have had to just deal with adultist instructors for a long time. And so it might be a bit of a shock to their system if they're asked, how they would like to be helped. But it's really important to get these students involved and excited about the work they're doing, instead of just kind of feeding them everything that they should be doing. The next intervention is respecting student autonomy. So kind of with the same thing as I was saying earlier, is just treating these students as human. So all students, regardless of age, are capable of thinking, growing, and learning. Educators, most of all, should understand this and demonstrate respect for student autonomy and encourage them to think for themselves. By allowing students more choices in their education, instructors can help mitigate the impacts of adultism. Like I said earlier, regardless of age, each student is an individual who has wants and needs and autonomy to make choices for themselves. And so obviously there has to be some sort of structure in a classroom or in a learning environment, but respecting the student's choice to maybe not participate in a classroom discussion because maybe they feel uncomfortable in front of the students. Maybe they have a bit of social anxiety. Those are all real things that could prevent a student from having a meaningful engagement in the classroom. And so respecting their choice to refrain from that is important, because it's not necessarily indicative of them not learning. It might just be their comfortability is not there yet. And so respecting that autonomy is the first step to understanding students and then working with them to create a better learning environment for everyone. And then the last intervention is altering the paradigm. So when engaging with younger students, be aware of the position of power you hold by virtue of your age and work to disrupt this. By altering the paradigm and allowing youth to make decisions, educators empower their students to think critically and act with purpose. This is a major step in working to reverse internalized adultism that young people may experience. So altering the paradigm is not necessarily just having your students run crazy and do whatever they want. It's more so acknowledging the position that you hold and then stepping back and letting the students kind of drive the lesson or the discussion or whatever it is that you're doing. In doing this, you let them practice their autonomy and they gain some confidence in making decisions and thinking critically about different problems. And it helps to combat internalized adultism that they might have experienced when they were younger. And it just allows them to be more confident in their choices going forward. And hopefully by altering this paradigm, the cycle will get broken and young adults won't be treated as less because they have, less experience under their belt by virtue of their age. So after all of that, we have an institutional view. What have universities done? So I've talked about some different interventions. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these interventions have research that backs them up. So it's not just like I threw these out there and there's nothing back. If you want to check out the research, check out our references. But I'm going to give you some case studies of some universities now that have employed different programs to support their non-traditional students. And by no means am I saying that these are the perfect programs, but they are a step. And I think it's really important to see what they have done so we can gauge, what we can do and the change that we can advocate for when we are at our own institutions. So first up, we have contemporary services for non-traditional students. So in an attempt to make education accessible to all, many universities have employed various degree programs that take into account the potential needs of their older students. In this section, we will explore how a few specific universities have attempted to serve these students. So the first university that we have is Ohio University. Hooray! So, OH, everybody. Through their prior learning assessment program, an adult learner can submit professional experience to be considered and potentially counted as credit toward their degree. So this is really cool because it allows adult learners to use their previous work experience or life experience to count as credit. And then it allows them to not have to take so many classes. It allows them to count a lot of, the things that they've done as part of their education, because not all education happens in the classroom. And it's really important and just cool that Ohio University acknowledges that and allows older adults to use the knowledge that they have from previous life experiences to better their degree in the future. And then they also have the Division of Lifelong Learning that works to offer flexible and meaningful courses that integrate life, work, and learning for students of all ages. So these flexible courses allow non-traditional students to work around potentially their work schedules, their life schedules, and even take online classes that are potentially remote, so they don't have to necessarily be in Ohio to obtain a degree from Ohio University. Next, we have the University of Texas at Dallas. They offer self-paced online courses that do not require enrollment to the university. So this makes these courses are accessible to all, and it's really nice that they don't have to be enrolled in the university, because then that can be a way of gatekeeping a lot of people from these courses. So by waiving that requirement, they have opened the door for a lot of non-traditional students to get an education. They also offer a wide variety of evening courses that suit the diverse student schedules of students. And then what I found really cool is that anyone aged 65 and older qualifies for free tuition if they're enrolled in 6 credit hours. So this is just incredible for multiple reasons, but it just really acknowledges that learning is a lifelong process, and students can be 18 or they can be 80. And by waiving this tuition requirement for students that are 65 and older, they've really opened the door for a lot of older students who might not go back for a degree to get one, because they have the opportunity to do so and they won't be financially burdened by doing so. And so this has really made higher education accessible for different non-traditional students. And then we have Regis University, which is our only private university here on the list. This has fast-tracked study programs that only take 6 to 8 weeks to complete, so they're very quick and allow students to complete them on their own time. They have a school for professional advancement that is specifically designed for adult learners and works to accommodate their work and family lives. So kind of like we have a college of education, this is a college specifically for non-traditional students, so they can get further in their careers. And then they also have a low student to faculty ratio, which ensures that the adult students receive the attention they need. Obviously, this isn't possible at all universities, but having this ratio really helps students get the extra assistance if they are struggling in any of their courses. And then this isn't a university, but I think it's important to bring attention to the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, the CAEL. The CAEL was founded in 1974 with the goal of providing organizations the tools, resources, and solutions needed to effectively support adult learners. They offer consulting to organizations to help identify the problems surrounding their adult education programs. And they use data collection and analysis to offer solutions that better suit adult learners and their needs as they navigate the workforce and the education system. So the CAEL is really cool because it is a separate organization that can go into universities, identify potential barriers for adult learners, potential issues at a university or another organization, and then offer solutions to work toward better accommodating these populations of students. So it's a really cool organization. It doesn't just go around and do this for universities out of the blue. It's an organization that has to be hired to come out and do this research and work. But it's a really, really cool organization that is trying to help universities become more accessible for adult learners. And I think it's important to note because their work is so important, and having the CAEL just even exist is such a step forward for adult learners everywhere. And so I believe I read on their website that they've already been involved in helping over 300 organizations. So small numbers, but they have work to do. And I just think it's a really cool resource that advocates for adult learners in all different types of organizations, not just higher ed. So, in conclusion, ageism and adultism are very real things in universities, and they're not often talked about. And so I encourage you guys to just think about what you can do as a student affairs professional and practitioner to support your students of all ages, and to kind of, like I said, reverse that paradigm and encourage your younger students to take ownership of their autonomy and to make decisions and think critically, and then encourage your older students to get involved and to meet younger students. And just bridging these gaps is the biggest importance to ensure that we're combating ageism and adultism. So I hope you guys enjoyed our presentation and have fun doing our module.